Thank you for joining our seminar. Let me introduce our speaker today, Lin. Lin is our faculty candidate for the data science department. She is currently a PhD candidate in the CS department at the University of Virginia. Her research interests include AI, data mining, and advanced machine learning on graph structured data. She focuses on utilizing graph structure to advance machine learning in a trustworthy manner. Her topic today is graph structure as a double-edged sword in machine learning. So, Lu, it's your stage now.
Okay, thank you for your nice introduction, Grace. And thank you all for coming to my talk. And hello, everyone. I'm Lu Lin, and I'm currently a fifth-year PhD student at University of Virginia. And today I'll be talking about my research on graph structure, which in my opinion is a double-edged sword for machine learning. So why do we want to study graph structure? Well, because our world is highly structured. So this means that instead of thinking of our world or a given domain as a set of isolated and independent data points, we want to study the relations, especially the collective graph structure within these entities. And actually, graph structure is a quite general language to describe or analyze the relational data. For example, in the nature world, we have molecule network and neural network. And in our human world, our activities can generate multiple types of networks. For example, the social network and economic network. And we actually build massive networks. For example, the internet to connect computers or the traffic network to connect different places. So what could happen when machine learning meets graph? Well, we can achieve more accurate predictions by utilizing the relationships within data. So in that sense, graph structure actually brings in tremendous opportunities to help us facilitate machine learning. So in that sense, graph structure can provide both explicit information and implicit information. So for explicit information, the edges actually can reflect whether two nodes are connected. And that can serve as natural label for many different machine learning tasks like link prediction. And the edges can also serve as guidance to aggregate features for many machine learning models like graph convolutional networks. And for implicit information, the graph structure can provide cluster or community of these entities. And that can give collective patterns to help machine learning model better analyze the individual behavior of these entities. And with the information provided by graph structure, we have seen tremendous progress when combining machine learning with graph structure in recent years. For example, Google improves their ETA service using graph convolutional network model on transportation network. And DeepMind can achieve a scientific breakthrough by modeling the structure of folded protein graphs in the biology domain. So while we enjoy these successful applications and the opportunities brought by graph structure, we cannot ignore potential pitfalls when the graph structure is used in an undesired way. And in fact, the misuse of graph structure could lead to serious threats to the accountability and trustworthiness of machine learning. And one concern is the ethical issue when a machine learning model is trained on a biased graph, and that could lead to unfair decision-making to different groups of people. And let me use an example here to illustrate this ethical issue. In real-world graphs, the structure are usually formed by some effects like the homophily effect. So this means that people with similar demographic features like gender or age or race tend to connect with each other. And such sensitive demographic features are likely to be associated with human-like bias. For example, males usually have higher employment rate than females. Then if we train a machine learning model on such a biased graph and use such a trained model to do job recommendation or hiring decisions, then it's likely that this model will make unfair decisions to the group of females, simply because these females are more likely to be connected with other females, and females are less likely to be employed. So this will lead to serious unfair job market. And this example suggests that biased graph could lead to unfair machine learning outcomes and decisions. And another issue is regarding security. When the networks or graphs which are used to train a machine learning model can be penetrated by an adversary. For example, a phishing scammer can intentionally build connections with friends of a normal user. Then a machine learning model trained on such a perturbed structure may recommend this phishing scammer to a normal user. And that could lead to serious security consequences. So we see that graph structure is indeed a double-edged sword for machine learning. Because on one side, it is a treasure chest of information because it can provide explicit relational information and implicit clustering information to help machine learning better learn the patterns of the data. But on the other hand, it could be Pandora opening a box because ethical issue could arise due to biased structure, or security issue can happen because the structure could be maliciously altered. And my research is about machine learning with graph structure, which is inspired by network science and graph theory. It's to study how we can balance these two sides of graph structure, so we can better utilize the opportunities brought by explicit and implicit information while mitigating the potential pitfalls that could threat the fairness and robustness of machine learning models. And to be more specific, on the opportunity side, my work will study how to use explicit relational information to help advance unsupervised machine learning models like topic model, autoencoder, or item response models. And another line of my work is to study how we can discover and exploit implicit cluster information to help advance machine learning models like graph convolutional networks, and also its applications to different domains like traffic or social opinion discovery. And on the other side, my work will understand and mitigate structural bias such that we can achieve a more fair machine learning model. And I have also explored on how to understand and evaluate the structural robustness so we can achieve a more robust model on altered structures. And in today's talk, I will mainly focus on 3 representative works of my research. And let's first start with the one that uses explicit relational information to help advance topic model, which is a classic unsupervised machine learning models. And as we know, supervised machine learning has been proven powerful and dominating in many domains. And it basically takes in features and associated with its labels, and then aims to learn a model that can maximize the likelihood of observing the label given the features. But the limitation is also clear that supervised machine learning requires a large amount of labeled data, and labels can be hard to obtain. And unsupervised machine learning, on the other hand, does not require any label information, but it can discover and utilize the intrinsic patterns within data. So it basically achieves this by maximizing the likelihood of observing the data itself. But unsupervised machine learning could be quite challenging because we do not have clear and optimal goals for the model to learn. And now, fortunately, we have graph structure. And graph structure can provide explicit relations and edges exist among entities to help guide the learning process of unsupervised machine learning. And such relationship information is quite informative, and more importantly, it's free compared with label information. And this principle can be applied to multiple tasks. And in today's talk, I will focus on the text understanding task. So for text understanding, the goal is to obtain the knowledge given a massive corpus of documents. And the knowledge could be what kind of topics these documents are talking about, or can we distill some keywords to abstract these documents, or what are the author's interests when writing these documents. So topic model is a unsupervised statistical model that is to discover the hidden topics given a corpus. And the basic idea is that it assumes that there is a hidden distribution of topics. So when the God or nature generate this corpus of documents, it will first sample a topic for a document, and then based on that topic, further sample the actual words of that document. And iteratively doing so will generate the whole corpus of all the documents. So based on such a assumed generative process, the goal of topic model is to uncover the hidden topic variables by maximizing the likelihood of observing the actual words of these documents given such a generative process or a statistical process. But the limitation of traditional topic model is that it assumes that documents are usually independent. And actually, this is not true for real-world documents because real-world documents are usually structured. For example, the documents for different users are actually connected by the social connection of these users. An example could be like the document could be papers, and these papers are correlated with each other by the co-authorship of these authors, right? So inspired by network science, that connection means proximity, we now can use the relationship of these users or authors to help guide the learning process of these hidden topics. So the insight is that if the documents belong to the authors who are connected, then the topics of these documents should be similar. So this will help us to revise the assumed generative process a bit. Basically, by nature, each user will have an interest vector. So we can estimate the proximity of two users based on the inner product of their interest vector and further generate the relationships of these users. So this tells how the nature can generate the actual relationships. And based on this interest vector of these users, the topic of these documents are further sampled, and then the actual words of these documents are sampled based on the topics. So this generative process can now not only generating the documents, but also the explicit relationships. So to be more specific, by nature, the God will generate the user interest. And based on that, it will generate the topic of these documents for this user and the actual words of these documents. And more important thing is that it can further generate the proximity of these users. And based on that, to generate the actual relationship of this user or document or authors. So this revised generative process can take into account both the text information and the relationship information. And with this process, we will now write out the training objective which is not only maximizing the likelihood on the individual documents, but also their correlations. And we can actually derive this objective by variational inference, but we will leave that part and only discuss the key information brought by this relationship. So basically, we can inject this explicit relationship information to help guide the process of uncovering the underlying topics. And the basic idea is, if the documents belong to users who are connected, then the topics should be correlated. The topics should be similar, and also the user interest should be similar. So with this guidance, we can uncover user representations, user similarity, topic of documents, topic representations, and topic similarity and meaning, all this kind of knowledge about these corpus. And let's say how this model performed in real-world data. So the first experiment will evaluate the model's predictive performance on unseen documents on Yelp and Stack Overflow dataset. And a lower perplexity reflects a better predictive performance. And we see that now, after including the graph structure, especially the explicit relationship information, we can achieve a much lower perplexity. And this suggests that we can better predict the content of documents using their relationships. And furthermore, we can visualize the topics captured by the model on Stack Overflow corpus. So these dots represent the users, and we visualize the user's representation in such a 2D space. And the color identify their topic interest. For example, for these users in orange, they're mainly talking about network communication. And for these users in purple, they're interested in circle or database. And similarly, we can uncover all the topic interest of these users. And a more interesting finding is that since we inject the relationship of this user, actually we can also uncover the correlation of topics. For example, if we look at these closely related users like the purple and orange users, they are related with each other because they are embedded close in the space. And their underlying topics are also correlated. For example, they are talking about network communication and database, and apparently these topics are indeed correlated. And an opposite example is about these green users. For example, the dark green users are talking about user interface, and these light green users are talking about C++ language. And apparently, these users are less correlated because they are embedded very far away in the space. And these topics are also less correlated. So this visualization shows that we can capture the topic correlations using the document relationships. So this basically introduces how we can use explicit information to help advance unsupervised machine learning, because the relationship information can help to guide the learning process. And the next work, I will introduce how we can discover and use implicit clustering information to help advance graph convolutional network. So we introduced like the explicit relationship information can be used for unsupervised machine learning. And what we ignored is that implicit clustering information also exists. And such implicit cluster actually provide collective patterns that can be used to help understand and study the behavior of these individual entities. And graph clustering actually has been studied for decades in the domain of graph theory. And the basic idea is that nodes can form groups or clusters based on their connectivity. And graph clustering can be applied to many applications. For example, in social network, graph clustering can help find social circles. And a lot of algorithms has been developed for this graph clustering problem, like minimum cut or stochastic block models or spectral clustering. And graph clustering can also be conducted in a hierarchical way. For example, if we look at this network, these nodes can be clustered into small groups. And if we expand our scope to look at these clusters and these nodes in a more global perspective, then these small clusters can further form into larger clusters. And you may ask, okay, beyond explicit edges, then what additional information does such cluster provide? And let me try to answer this question using an example here. So if we look at the nodes labeled by red, like node 1, node 2, and node I, simply based on relationship information, actually we cannot differentiate like which node is more important to node I. And now if we have cluster information, actually we can provide another path to connect node 2 and node I because they belong to the same blue cluster. So it's reasonable to infer that node 2 should be more close to node I compared with node 1. And similarly, if we look at node 1, node I, and node 3, since node 1 and node I all belong to the same higher order cluster, like this gray cluster, then node I should be more close to node 1 should be more close to node I compared with node 3. So from this example, we show that binary edges or relationships cannot help us better differentiate the connected neighbor nodes. And actually clusters can offer another way for us to study the correlation between nodes. And the meaning is that nodes within the same cluster should be more close if we want to embed those nodes in the embedding space. Then how can we use such cluster information to help graph convolutional network? And before that, we can first briefly discuss and introduce what is graph convolutional network. So it's basically a convolutional operation on graphs. So to generate the representations for node I, graph convolutional network will first check its neighbors and aggregate the features of these neighbors. And then it will combine this neighbor's feature with its own feature to update the state of the target node I. But the limitation is that graph convolutional network cannot differentiate the importance of neighbors because it only considers this explicit relationship information. Then let's say how we can help advanced graph convolutional network with cluster information. Let's say we have several clusters and each cluster can be profiled by a corresponding embedding. So these embeddings can construct an embedding matrix, that is this phi matrix. Then we can first calculate the cluster affiliation of each node by taking the inner product between this cluster embedding and its node feature or the state. So this basically tells us how likely this node will belong to these different clusters. And we will use such an affiliation vector to contain this kind of information. And similarly, for the other neighboring nodes, we can also calculate such an affiliation vector. And then we can calculate a cluster level node proximity based on the inner product of this affiliation vector. And this tells us how likely two nodes will belong to the same cluster. So we can revise and improve the aggregation function of graph convolutional network by using this cluster proximity to differentiate these neighboring nodes. And actually, this operation can be generalized to any convolutional layer. For example, we can have first layer cluster, second layer clusters, and then we can conduct the similar calculation to give us the second layer cluster affiliation and the corresponding cluster proximity. So basically, for each convolutional layer, we can calculate its corresponding class proximity to help revise and improve the aggregation function to be more fine-grained. So we can differentiate the importance of these neighbor nodes based on such a cluster level proximity. And that is beyond the explicit relationship information. Then let's say how it looks like for real data set. Then this experiment will visualize the captured hierarchical clustering on Facebook page network. And we will visualize these pages by their representations in the 2D space. And for the left figure, the color identify the first layer clusters captured by the model. And for the right figure, these colors will identify the second layer clusters. And we can observe a clear pattern that small clusters in the lower layer will merge into larger cluster in the higher layer. And this actually suggests that our model can capture the implicit hierarchical clusters from graph structure. And more importantly, if we inject this implicit information to graph convolutional network, we can obtain better representations. So we will evaluate the quality of the learned representations on a recommendation task for Facebook. So basically it's to recommend the friendship on Facebook dataset. And a higher AUC value indicate a better performance for recommendation. And we see that our model with hierarchical clustering information can outperform the baselines with a clear margin. So that basically suggests hierarchical clustering information can indeed help learn better representations. So for this work, I have shown how we can discover and exploit such implicit clustering information for graph convolutional network. And to really apply these models to some real-world applications, we cannot ignore potential pitfalls if the structure is used in an undesired way. So next, I will try to explain our work on understanding and mitigating structural bias so we can achieve a more fair machine learning model. And a question would be, what does bias mean for machine learning? So actually, we as humans understand the world by associating complicated sensory inputs with some simplified groups, so we can reduce the complexity of our world. And sometimes such simplification could be good and helpful. For example, the inductive bias can provide some prior knowledge and assumptions for us to simplify machine learning models. But sometimes such bias could be harmful and result in stereotypes when undesired features, like some sensitive demographic features, confound the decisions. And such undesired bias could happen at all stages of machine learning lifecycle. For example, in the stage of data collection, undesired bias could happen due to imbalanced data or some unwanted association between sensitive feature and human-like bias. And in the stage of model training, the undesired bias could caused by lack of uncertainty or interpretability of the machine learning model, or in effect, feedback loops to calibrate the learning process. And in the stage of evaluation, undesired bias could be hardly to be discovered due to simple performance metrics like simply accuracy, or due to the evaluation, which is done in bulk, and the lack of detailed analysis with respect to different subgroups or subpopulations. And in today's talk, I will try to show you how we can understand the cause of structural bias on graph structure, and how can we mitigate the bias by calibrating the training objective in the training loop, and how to evaluate the model beyond accuracy. So let's say first look at, okay, then what could happen when machine learning model meets a biased graph? So I will show you with a representation learning task as an example. So this task is basically to learn a model that can embed the node in an embedding space. And the learning process is conducted by trying to reconstruct the edges from the observed graph. And the issue is this observed graph usually involve sensitive features on nodes, such as some demographic feature like gender or race or age or race. And such sensitive feature could also influence the structure by homophily effect. So sometimes similar nodes with similar like gender or race will connect with each other. So that will result in biased feature or biased structure. So with this sensitive feature and biased structure involved in the observed graph, it will cause biased embedding. So it means the learned embedding could be correlated with the sensitive feature. Then such correlation actually could result in unfair predictions, because the sensitive feature is related to the biased embedding, and that could confound decisions for some downstream tasks. So the question is, how can we achieve a less biased machine learning outcome from such a biased graph? And a trivial solution could be, how about we just remove the sensitive feature from nodes? And actually that is not enough, because the structure is still biased. So we can still infer the sensitive feature from the learned embeddings from such a biased structure. And if we look at the detailed training objective, we can see that even though we will exclude sensitive feature and only use this non-sensitive feature to encode the graph, the edges which are used to reconstruct the observed graph are still sampled from a biased structure. So to achieve a less biased machine learning model, in an ideal case, actually we want the training objective to sample edges from an unbiased structure. And this unbiased structure actually is the structure of a bias-free graph. For this graph, we do not have any sensitive feature, and the structure is not influenced by a sensitive feature. So this is an ideal graph we want to learn our model. But the issue is we can only observe this biased graph, and this bias-free graph actually is only imaginary. Then what can we do now? And actually, the principle of our debiasing work is that even though we can only learn or train our model on such a observed biased graph, we can still build a connection between biased and bias-free graph. So we can achieve an effect as if we are training our model on this imaginary bias-free graph. How can we achieve this? Well, basically, how can we connect the biased and bias-free graph? And actually, we will use an assumption here that both biased and bias-free graph are generated or originate from the same underlying structural graph. And this is actually a common assumption in network science. So for this structural graph, it does not involve any features. So the edge distribution, which reflect the probability of existing an edge between two nodes, is governed by a structural model. And this structural model basically is to control some structural property of this graph, like heavy tail degree distribution or small word diameter or shrinking diameter. Then similarly for this bias-free graph, because it involves the non-sensitive features, then the edge distribution will condition on both structural model and the non-sensitive features. And for the biased observed graph, the edge distribution will condition on structural model, non-sensitive feature, and sensitive features. So the next question is, if we want to connect these two graphs, how can we directly build the connection of their edge distribution so we can connect these two graphs? And remind that this bias-free graph is imaginary. We don't know the actual edge distribution actually. But fortunately, based on our derivation, this unknown edge distribution can be decomposed into two parts. The first one is regarding the structural model, and that is unknown to us. But luckily, the latter term, this one actually does not evolve this structural model, which is unknown. So now this term can be estimated from the observed graph. And similarly, for the biased observed graph, we can conduct the same decomposition. And by taking the ratio for both sides, the good news is that we can now cancel out this unknown term. Then now we will actually estimate the correlation between these two graphs using this term, and all the terms in this term are can be estimated from this observed graph. And we can simplify the notation using R here. So we show that now we can build the connection between these two graphs via this edge distribution. And next, let's say how we can use such a connection to calibrate the training process. So actually, the biased training objective can be reweighted using this correlation. And the good property of this reweighted training objective is that in expectation, we can prove that this resulting loss actually is a unbiased loss with respect to the bias-free graph. So it basically means that in expectation, we are sampling edges from a bias-free structure. And that can leave us to the effect that as if we are training our model on an unbiased graph. And basically using this reweighted training objective, we can now remove both feature bias and structural bias. And we can also relate these two graphs from another perspective. And as we mentioned, this actual edge distribution for each node pair is not known for us on this bias-free graph. But we can estimate the group level edge distribution. So we can marginalize out the effect of this unknown structural model. And the basic idea is that for a certain feature combination, we can sample node pairs with such a feature combination and average the edge probability outputted by the model. So now we can estimate this group of nodes like with this kind of feature combination and reflect how likely there is an edge exist between two nodes if these two nodes have this kind of feature combination. And similarly, we can estimate a group level edge distribution for the biased observed graph. Then now we can build the connection of these two graphs by making their group level edge distribution to be similar. And the implication or idea behind this is that after including this sensitive feature or without this sensitive feature, the resulted group level edge distribution should be the same. So this effect of sensitive feature should be independent from the resulting edge distribution. So with this implication, we will now revise the training objective by introducing a regularization term. And the meaning of this term is that we want to minimize the discrepancy between the group level edge distribution on these two graphs. And now we show that we can reweight the training objective, which in expectation give us an unbiased loss. And we can also regularize this training objective. And naturally, we can combine both, which will give us the final solution for an unbiased training objective on graphs. Then let's say how it performs on real data set. Then the first experiment is to visualize the learned representations on POCAC dataset, which is a social network dataset. And the color will indicate the sensitive feature gender, so it's either female or male. Then for this left figure, it shows the representations in the 2D space without any debiasing strategy. And we see there is a clear cluster pattern, and that suggests that without any debiasing, the learned representations are associated with sensitive feature. And for the right-hand side figure, this one shows the learned representations after applying the debiasing strategy I just introduced. So we see this cluster actually diminish. So this verifies that we can break the connection between the learned representations and the sensitive feature. So we can achieve a debiasing effect here. And the next experiment is to show how we can achieve a better trade-off between prediction utility and the effect of unbiasedness. So for the prediction utility, it basically reflects how the model can perform for downstream task. And this downstream task is link prediction. And for unbiasedness is to reflect whether we can predict the sensitive feature from these learned representations. And ideally, we should not have good performance to predict the sensitive feature because we want to break the connection between the representations and the sensitive feature. So a good effect of unbiasedness should have a small micro F1 score on sensitive features. And this random model actually is a reference for the best debiasing effect, because it will output a random embedding, and ideally this random embedding should not associated with any sensitive information. And this node-to-vect reference will represent the best prediction utility we can achieve, because it does not include any debiasing strategy. So presumably it should give us a best prediction utility. So ideally, we want to locate at the top left corner for our models. And for baselines, like Fairwork or CFC, so for these two baselines, they can slightly improve the effect of unbiasedness by moving toward the left side of this figure. But our model can achieve a much better trade-off by moving towards the top left corner, and some of them actually locate at this top left corner. So this indicates that our model and our debiasing strategy can achieve a much better trade-off between a prediction utility and unbiasedness. And we also study the trade-off between prediction utility and a commonly used fairness metric, that is demographic parity. And similarly, our model can also achieve a better trade-off by locating close to the top left corner compared with these baselines. So from this experiment, we show how we can understand and mitigate structural bias so we can achieve a more fair machine learning model and machine learning outcomes. And to summarize, I have basically shown that graph structure is indeed a double-edged sword for machine learning because it brings in opportunities for explicit and implicit information to help facilitate machine learning. And it also could bring in potential pitfalls, which will raise ethical issue or security issue. And I also show you my works on take advantage of this graph structure and mitigating its potential shortcomings for a more effective and trustworthy machine learning model. And this basically concludes my past works. And for my future work, I plan to further unleash the power of graph structure in a more trustworthy way. So the first line of work will be to design a formal foundation and framework to define and study the trustworthy properties on graph structure. And I have done some works on fairness and robustness. And I will definitely continue this direction and also include the studies on privacy for graph structure data. And another important line is to improve the scalability of graph machine learning models. So we can scale the previously mentioned unsupervised machine learning to more complex graph structure data. And this can be achieved by enabling distributed and federated machine learning on large scale and multimodal graph structural model or graph structural data. Sorry. And I also plan to further improve the interpretability of machine learning, because previously I showed we can infer some hidden cluster structure of graph structured data, but a more important aspect would be how can we infer some hidden structure that could help machine learning to answer not only associative questions, but also causal questions using graphical models on graph structured data. And we have studied some user-generated graph data like social networks or traffic networks. And a very important extension to this work is that we can also study the structure of science and the structure of nature. So we can advance scientific computing using graph machine learning, like in domains like biology, physics, or geography. So I believe my past works and my future plan are essential to realize the vision that artificial intelligence should connect the world in an ethical, interpretable, and trustworthy way. So in the end, I want to thank my advisor, my collaborators, my friends, and these institutes for their great support during my research and my PhD life. And thank you all for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, well, thank you so much for the talk. Any question from the audience?
Yeah. So hi, Lulin. So this is hi.
Hi.
Thank you for excellent talk. Very interesting topic. So so I'm also working on privacy security on graph. I have a couple of questions. One is this in slide number 26. You mentioned the perplexity in an NLP task using graph over there, right? So yeah. I see the perplexity is very large. Compared with the state-of-the-art NLP model, usually we achieve like perplexity like 25 or 32. Why you have perplexity kind of like thousands there? So would it be like a practical level of perplexity or not? That is one questions. So and the second question is do you have any theoretical bound on the unbiased level of your GCN model? Because you're saying that you can achieve basically the effect of unbiased, unbiased, even the gender, right? Do you have any theoretical bound or just empirical results? And I have the third one, but like maybe we can talk offline. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you for your great question. So for the first question about the perplexity, so indeed, topic model actually is not it's not definitely the most advanced model to like predict natural language, to predict the text compared with these advanced like natural language models. So the perplexity indeed is not as impressive as these advanced NLP models. But I think the takeaway or the most important message here is that including relationship, even for topic model, can help. Then actually we can like extend this insight to other NLP models, right? So using the correlations, for example, between sentence or different maybe documents for NLP models, then presumably we can achieve a better performance. So I think this insight of including graph structure does not limit to this topic model, but can generalize to other NLP models. So yeah,
thank you. I have something to say here. Basically, we work with Adobe. We have two models. One is significantly improve the state of the art, but the perplexity is not good. They say that okay, so it's not good. They're not gonna fire patterns for that because it cannot be applied in the real world. And the other model is basically more simpler, but they achieved very high perplexity. Then they go for patterns, and we have a US pattern submitted, something like that. So I think like that is one of the angle to see, like whether we can do a better job here to close the gap with the state of the art, right? Yeah, but yes. Just one minor things there. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for the tips and the explanation. Yeah, indeed. We can definitely try to bridge the gap. Yes, and also actually topic model. I guess topic model. The benefit of topic model is that it can provide some the knowledge discovered, which can be interpreted by human, like the topics. What kind of topics we can discover from this document, and that actually cannot be well explained by some NLP model, which can give us very good metrics like perplexity, right? So definitely we can try to combine both, so we can like bring the benefit from both models. Yeah. And for the second question about unbiasedness, so actually the results are indeed many about empirical improvement using our strategies, but actually for the first approach, we can also provide some theoretical contribution. So we can prove that in expectation, reweighting the biased training objective can give us a unbiased loss. So basically, these edges can sample from a bias-free structure. So that can give us a effect that as if we are learning our model on a unbiased graph. So I guess this is the theoretical contribution of our model. Yes, and yeah, I hope that answered your question.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we can talk more on this. Very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for great questions.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions?
Hi.
Hi.
Sorry. Should I go again?
Yeah, Hua, go ahead.
Yeah. I personally learned a lot from your lecture and really enjoy your stories. I think the examples and illustrations on your slides is very informative. And so my question here is only about some clarifications on your future work. So you said you want to scale up. So I wonder what's the scale of your work now, and to what kind of scale are you expecting to?
Yeah, that's a good question. So currently I've studied graphs with scale like from thousands of nodes to millions of nodes. But the issue is that when we are dealing with millions of nodes, the training process is very slow. So we need to each time we will sample a subset of this graph, right, and train the model for multiple epochs, and that will be very costly. So we want to scale the model to large graph data so that we can efficiently train our model on large graph. So in that sense, I plan to enable distributed and federated machine learning training on graph data, and that could also be quite challenging because it will include some challenges like how do you partition the graph data, and how do you partition it in a IID style, or how do you fix this non-IID partition? So this kind of challenge, so we can achieve a comparable training performance with this kind of with this current slow but more accurate maybe training procedure. So I think the next step is definitely to enable and to especially to provide some maybe theoretical guarantee about the possible errors when you compress when you partition the graph for distributed training, and how to maybe compress the gradient information from different workers and servers, and how do you control the errors that could happen due to this kind of approximation. So that these are all very important topics I will try to solve in this line of my future work. Yeah.
Yes, thanks for the clarification. And that'd be my question. I think the other one could also have some other questions.
Yeah, thank you for your question.
Hi, I have some quick question. I think the performance of such graphic models probably will depend on the accuracy of the edge information. But in some applications, such edge information may not be 100% accurate. For example, some edges may not exist, and also some edge may be wrong. So I just wonder the sensitivity of your model, to such incorrect information. For example, maybe 30% edges are wrong, or maybe 10% edge are missing. So I'm just curious about the sensitivity of such a graphic model to this kind of inaccuracy of the edge information.
That's a great question. So basically, the edge information could be missing or noisy. So that could lead to maybe inaccurate predictions of these models. So I think that's a very interesting and also a challenging task, and also maybe an open problem in graph machine learning. So basically, people are studying how to deal with, for example, heteromorphily of data of graph data, if the edge information cannot accurately reflect the proximity of these nodes. So for that kind of challenge, actually, one line of my work will try to study this perturbation of, I would say it as kind of a perturbation to the structure. So if the structure is not perfect, how will that influence the model's performance? So actually, that's basically another line of my work to study this kind of structural robustness. And the key idea is that actually, indeed, very small perturbation to the graph structure will lead to a large change to the output of machine learning model. So that's a very important direction to pursue, and to really improve the reliability and the trustworthiness of graph machine learning. Yes. Thank you for the great question.
Yeah, I have a follow-up questions regarding the perturbation. Are you directly perturbate the edge, or you perturbate the eigenvalue of the graph?
Yeah, for this, that's a great question. So for this work, actually, we will perturb the edges, but how to perturb the edges is guided by the change of eigenvalues in this work. So we want to perturb the edges by maximizing the change of the eigenvalue of the eigen or spectrum distribution of this graph. So we can basically disrupt the spectral filters for graph convolutional networks. So we don't need to require any model output information, like querying the output of the model, or we don't need any architecture information about this model. So basically we can conduct such attack in a black box manner. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. Yeah, that's it for today. And Lu, you need to end this talk and join another Zoom link to talk to our dean, Frank.
Okay. Thank you for your great questions and all listening. Yeah. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Okay.